Welcome, everyone. I'm Arsalan Arif with Endpoints News, and you're watching Why Can't We Agree on How to Define Digital Twins in Healthcare? The term digital twins is not new. Michael Greaves at the University of Michigan is credited with coining the term in 2002 while talking about improving product manufacturing efficiency. NASA featured the term in their 2010 technological roadmap for simulated spacecraft. Today, the term digital twin is a buzzword heard across the healthcare industry that describes everything from AI-based simulations of disease progression to mechanistic models of organ or cellular function. With so many meanings and applications for digital twins in circulation, it seems that people aren't operating on a clear definition of what digital twins are, as well as what they are not. Today's panel seeks to cut through the complexity and arrive at a definition for digital twins and how they can be applied within healthcare. If you have any questions during today's webinar, our panelists have reserved some time. Just hit the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen during today's discussion. I'm joined by Charles Fisher, CEO and co-founder of Unlearn, along with Francois Boissel, co-founder and CEO of Nova Discovery, Jonathan Baptista, co-founder and CEO of Deep Life, and Simon Sontag, founder and CEO of Vertonomy. We're going to kick off our discussion with a question to you, Charles. The title of this webinar is Why Can't We Agree on How to Define Digital Twins in Healthcare? So, do you think it's possible to arrive at a single definition, Charles?
I hope so. I think that it should be. I think the key aspect there is that when we talk about digital twins broadly, which again, I think as your intro talked about is a concept that originates in engineering, not in life sciences, that there are some core things that we think about digital twins within that broad context as providing. And then we can disagree potentially, or maybe not disagree, maybe that's not the right word. People can approach the problem of creating digital twins with different technologies. And I think that that's totally reasonable. You have different approaches to solve the problem to create what a digital twin is. But within healthcare, I think that there is kind of, first of all, people are often using the term unaware that it's being borrowed from engineering. If you go right now to your browser and you type in digitaltwin.com, it redirects you to General Electric's website. And it's not about people, right? Their whole thing is about how you are creating digital twins of jet engines and using them to basically perform experiments on jet engines in a computer that you wouldn't want to do in real life. You don't want to damage it and so forth. So I think that there's this really interesting opportunity that we have at the beginning of the use of this term in healthcare, as the beginning of companies who are really just charting this course of creating digital twins, of trying to bring awareness to what they really are and doing it early to make sure that we are in line with what people in engineering have been saying for the last 20 years as they've been using this term. For myself, I have heard people say things that I definitely think of as being digital twins. So I think you can create a digital twin of a person's heart, which would be a simulation of how that particular person's heart operates. You can create digital twins of people. You can create digital twins of devices. So maybe a person has an implant. You can create a digital twin of that implant. I've also heard people just referring to digital twin as a patient's electronic health record. Like, the data goes into a spreadsheet. It's in the computer, so it's digital. It's their digital twin. And that is very different from the way that term has been used in engineering. I think so much so that use, which is kind of becoming more widespread within the field, I think is detrimental to people's understanding. So I hope that we are able to come to an agreement. So we have a group of people today all working on creating digital twins that I think share the core thing that we mean when we talk about digital twins in science and engineering. So looking forward to the rest of this discussion.
All right. So our opportunity here is to try to get early and ahead of this in healthcare and try to get this all on the same page rather than one sort of definition like AI or patient records or all that kind of thing. So let's go to our panel over here and let's ask each of you about your company and how you define and apply digital twins. Let's start with you, Francois Boissel.
Thanks, Arsalan. Nova has built over the years a clinical trial simulation platform called Jinko, and we essentially combine within this platform disease models that are essentially mathematical representations of pathophysiologies with virtual patients. And out of this, you can derive multiple different applications, from identifying optimal responder profiles, optimizing the regimen of your drug, essentially everything that converges towards making your future trial in human subjects much more efficient, de-risked, and potentially accelerated. And I fully agree with Charles' opening comments. There are many different ways of approaching the digital twin space within healthcare. I'd also like to point out that it's potentially maybe slightly a misnomer, to the extent that there's no perfect replica of patients that you're recruiting in your trials. So the way we go about doing this with the Jinko platform is essentially using those mechanistic representations of models and generating virtual patients by reproducing the dynamics of the disease. So it actually is very synergistic with more data intensive and pure AI approaches. I'm happy to delve into this further after we finish the round of panelists.
Okay, thank you so much, Francois. Now let's move to Simon Sontag. Tell us about your company and tell us how you apply and define digital twins, Simon.
Yes, thanks a lot. So yeah, at Autonomy, we have created an end-to-end web platform enabling medical device developers to conduct testing and evaluation of clinical interventions in a virtual environment. By that, to reduce and eventually replace experiments in the lab and in animals and in humans, and reduce costs, time to market, and the risk to fail. And here our solution combines digital patient twins, this is how we call it, with artificial intelligence, multi-physics simulations, and predictive analytics. So for our digital patient twins, we use clinical data as input, among other things, imaging data, tissue material properties, hemodynamic boundary conditions, to then reproduce 3- or 4-dimensional virtual models of the patients. Then the user is able to perform all kinds of statistical population analysis, also multi-physics simulation like mechanical, fluid dynamical simulations, for example, to test durability of a stent in a blood flow, and in the end, then create a report of digital evidence or in silico evidence for the regulatory bodies. Very important for us is also that we perform rigorous verification and validation of the processes to prove the accuracy and being compliant to certain standards. And yeah, having this in mind, when I did some research, what I found out was that I really liked the definition that was provided by IBM. So here I can read this. So they define this as an environment of linked data and models that reproduce an accurate virtual representation of real-world entities or processes and uses simulation, machine learning, and reasoning to help decision making.
All right, thank you very much. Appreciate that, Simon. Now let's move to Jonathan Baptista. Please tell us about your company, how you apply digital twins, and your definition, Jonathan.
Hi, Arslan. Thank you very much for giving me the talk, doing stick. Actually, at Deep Life, what we develop is what we call digital twin of cell, but for drug discovery, it's kind of a cell type specific AI models that we train on multi-omics data, and then we use them to predict how a cell will react to a drug, a viruses, a gene editing, or any type of perturbation that we can see at a cellular level. And actually, it's quite pretty useful for biologists to help them prioritize targets or perform in silico screening on various perturbations that they would like to see in the lab, and saving some time and efforts. And also, it's also a very good way to reproduce quite on a large number of samples experiment. And if I have to define what is a digital twin, which is a very interesting question, so I had to do my homework about that as well. I think I would say something around a causal numerical modeling of a system that we can leverage to mimic the temporal evolution of its real-world counterpart. And in that being said, there is 2 things that, and I'm pretty sure that we will discuss that later, that are important in that definition. Is a causality in the model that make a lot of sense to make some interpretation of this with this digital twin. and the temporality. So I think it's also related to what other panelists said regarding dynamics.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much, Jonathan. Thank you for everyone for that. I do think that all of you have very congruent ideas about it, along with Charles and his team at Unlearn over there. And Francois, I want to ask you a question. We've already heard what Charles thinks about this question, but I want to hear what you have to say, Francois. How familiar do you think the healthcare industry is with the concept of digital twins?
Well, I think that the industry as a whole is not yet extremely familiar, but one has to recognize that it's growing fast. I mean, recognition is growing fast. Somehow, and it's probably the reason why we're having this conversation today, recognition is probably impeded by a confusion on the terminology and a lack of understanding of the definition. So it's a great opportunity to be able to clarify this today. As far as I can tell, but guys, feel free to correct me if I'm wrong. I do believe that the FDA has agreed to one external control arm to date. That was a hybrid combination of synthetic and real patient data. So, as soon as the FDA starts to recognize, it's safe to assume that the adoption will follow. But I would say that we're in the early days, and again, providing clarity as to the differences in the approaches, which is again fine, as Charles was mentioning in the opening comments. But so people get increasingly sophisticated on the applications and the limits of those various approaches.
Okay. Jonathan, let me get your take on this. There, like we've been talking about, so many definitions of digital twins out there. Can you help us elucidate some of the more common misperceptions that you have seen when talking about your technology at Deep Life?
Well, actually, there is two possible way that people get mistaken with what we do. I mean, it's two famous way people get mistaken with what we do. The first one is to think that what we do is on like predict binding affinity between chemicals, like on more like chemical novel, which is not what we do. Or the other one is thinking that we do a simulation of patients. That was again not something that we do. Actually, what we develop at Deep Life is more. It's only like models that model molecular activity within a cell to understand mechanism of action behind perturbations that we apply at a cellular level, like drug, viruses, and gene editing. It's a little bit like a Google map of the cell, where you would interrogate how to go from point A to B with a minimum perturbation to be applied. So really like a mathematical problem that we are trying to solve here. And well, maybe one day we will be able to assemble all those digital twins of particular cells to recreate tissues or part of tissues. But like the technical gap is still a big challenge, and we are not here yet for the moment.
Okay. Now let me go to you, Charles, now, because some people are using digital twins for diagnostic purposes and others for prognostic purposes. Do you think digital twins accurately describe both?
Yeah, I mean, again, I want to talk about how this is a broad term and there is some particular thread that is kind of going through it, right? And that thread is simulation, right? So you're trying to ask particular questions about things that you haven't actually seen. And again, there are very, very different uses of that. We heard Francois talk about potentially, using these things where you have simulations of people that you haven't actually measured certain kinds of things that you're going to use within clinical trials. We heard Jonathan talk about using simulations of cells, right? So these things encompass all of these different areas. The key thing is that you're using a computer simulation to ask questions about unseen things. And so there's kind of two different ways that you could think about doing that. One is which I would call diagnostic. So you have a patient and you've measured certain kinds of things about that patient, and you want to introspect to understand more about the patient's current state, right? So for example, potentially you measure some patients, I don't know, you measure various symptoms of a patient's disease. And now you're going to use a computer model to try to peer inside to understand, like, how is that patient's gene expression profile look like, given that you haven't observed it, you've only observed these higher level symptoms, right? So you're using a computer to sort of peer into and ask these things that are unseen questions. The other thing, which is about using this computer model, this simulation, to ask about the future, right? And to think about what, not only potentially what will happen in the real world in the future, but what would happen in the multiverse in the future, right? Under different scenarios of things that could happen to that patient. Right. So if you give this patient treatment A, if you give this patient treatment B, if you give this patient treatment C, what would happen to their digital twin? Right. Same kind of thing. You can bring that down again to the cellular level. Right. If you make this perturbation, that perturbation, that perturbation, what will the effects be in the future? How will it affect it? So those are like two different ways that you can think about what digital twins are doing and how they can be used. And again, it's a very, very, very broad category of thing that is connected by this idea of using computer simulation to effectively replace real world stuff, right? Because you could just run these experiments and you could be like, I'll give this person this drug and I'll just see what happens to their gene expression. I'll just measure it, right? But those experiments are often time consuming. Sometimes they're impossible. Sometimes you literally want to know about something that you can't measure. So we can do all of those things in a computer. I mean, I think that is fundamentally the thread that's going to go across all of these things.
Okay, let me ask every one of you a quick question over here and just see if I get an agreement from the panel. So what am I hearing is that digital twins across all these definitions, the one commonality here is that they all involve simulation. So is that right, Charles?
That is one of the key commonalities. Yeah. That's
Okay.
what I would say. The other thing that I think is important is that they are simulations of actual real life things, right? Because you could create a simulation of just, I don't know, some hypothetical thing. But here you're typically taking some data, input data, on a real thing, and you're using that as sort of inputs in some kind of computer simulation to ask these questions. And there's a variety of ways that happens. You know, if you take the General Electric example, you have a jet engine, and you put various sensors on that jet engine that measure, you know, its temperature and different operating characteristics, and you feed all that stuff in then to this computer model that allows you to simulate stuff about it. And so you take that analogy over to these different areas within life sciences.
Okay. Now, Simon, I want to move to you, and I'm going to keep harping on this question because I think it's so important. It's the title of our webinar and something we're really trying to get right over here. Tell me about you hearing digital twins used within healthcare that was not congruent with your definition. What are some common misperceptions or that's not quite right that you commonly hear?
Yeah, so in my opinion, I think the term digital twin is too general to be used in a meaningful way. So we have heard already that it can be used for physical devices, for predictive maintenance simulation, also then for 3D printed models or very complex predictive analysis. And somehow it became the digital twin has become some kind of a buzzword. So in the last year, so 3 years ago, I was at scientific conferences in our domain. It was still called like lump parameter models or 3D physical reconstructed models or hemodynamic simulation. But last week I attended another conference and suddenly everything is considered a digital twin. And even Forbes now has recently published an article about digital twins in healthcare. So this has also become a bit more mainstream now. And when we go back here to my definition or IBM's definition, I said that models that reproduce an accurate virtual representation. And I think an emphasis should here lie in the accurate part. So you can create all kinds of virtual representations that look nice. You can even use virtual reality. But when they are not accurate, should it still be called a digital twin? And this is something that is seen quite often now, unfortunately.
Right. So again, let me just make sure I have this right. So the definition is the models that reproduce an accurate representation, and any other kind of terms like digital twin being synonymous with patient records, something like that is not congruent, is what you're saying.
So it can, but of course it should also be then representing this in an accurate way. So when you have then also patient record system that reproduces an actual patient cohort, then this can also be associated with this. But the digital twin term is so broad that when you say only digital twin, that it has no meaning because you don't know in what direction this goes.
Okay. Francois, let me ask you. So Because I've heard digital twin almost synonymous with and interchangeable with AI and machine learning at this point, and even other types of simulation technology. So is that the case? Is digital twin technology always synonymous with AI and machine learning?
It's predominantly synonymous, only based on the number of providers of that type of technology. But I'd really, I share the view of the panelists that it's the sort of lowest common denominator for the definition is simulating. And one of the issues that, sort of pure AI approaches are running into is the fact that when you're using past trial data, first of all, you're making the implicit assumption that past is a good predictor of what's going to happen in the future, which, as far as human biology is concerned, is really not the case that often. The second potential issue you have is what I call hidden variables. So you'll have sort of 50 parameters that are being captured in a database for 100 patients, and you'll try to find in these databases proxies of baseline patients that you've just recruited in your trial to try and generate some synthetic control patients, some digital twins. So you might find a perfect match. This new patient has the same values for those 50 variables, the 50 parameters that are coming from your historical database, but maybe there are missing data that are very critical to predict the patient's response to the drug candidates, whether it's because you didn't capture them historically, or whether because they're not accessible to clinical measurements. So that's the reason why, and this has been mentioned on a couple of occasions before, it is important to capture the dynamics of the disease, so you can really sort of adjust for this limitation of being, sort of prisoners of historical data. And that's also the reason why I strongly believe that over time, there'll be a convergence between AI-generated insights and mechanistic models that are built on a causal representation of the disease process as we understand it.
Okay, thank you very much. I want to remind everyone in the audience here that we are taking questions. We have some time reserved for it. We are getting some nice ones here. So if you have any questions for our expert panelists here, and we do have a great panel here, please do get those questions in. I'm actually going to sneak one question in for the audience.
But Arslan, if you don't mind, maybe before you do that, I have a question for Francois,
Sure,
and maybe for the other panelists, because it's so this use of the term synthetic control arm, I think, is an interesting term within the industry, in part because there's nothing synthetic about it, right? So the way that people use the term is I will look for real patient data that exists from a historical trial, or I will go and look at data that's collected from routine care. And I will just select some patients from those existing things, and I will match, and I will say they matched to the trial in some particular way, usually on some one-dimensional characteristic, to be totally clear. So it's real patient data. There's nothing synthetic, like in computer science, when we talk about synthetic data, we talk about data that is being simulated, right? And there's nothing simulated about it. It's just the real patient whose electronic health record has been selected from a set. To me, there's nothing digital twin about that, in my opinion. And now I hear people are using that term, and they'll be like, "Oh, our synthetic controls, digital twins, these things are the same." To me, they're different. There's nothing about modeling and simulation that is really involved in that traditional approach to what people call a synthetic control arm at all. I don't know. Do we agree on that? Is that something that? Yeah.
Yeah, we absolutely agree. I would actually call what you've described a sort of external control arm, and not necessarily synthetic. And synthetic is when you start to try and extrapolate on the existing data sets, and this is where simulation kicks in. Trying to go beyond the confines of your historical data set. So external control arm is just matchmaking, and it's very flat and it doesn't lend itself to simulation, whereas synthetic, at least in the way I understand it, involves some simulation in some shape or form, where you actually extrapolate from those reconciled patients.
Yeah, but that's such an interesting case where the term that people are using within the industry means propensity score match selection of patients. That's what they use as synthetic, and there's nothing synthetic about it. It's like old virtual clinical trials that were just decentralized. There's nothing virtual about it. It's an interesting point, and now we're kind of in the same kind of kind of feel, I think is the exact reason for this kind of panel. What is a digital what is a digital twin? Are we going to do that same thing that we did with virtual trials and synthetic control arms, where people just take it to mean some other completely different thing than as originally intended?
Well, good reason for this webinar over here, definitely. Yeah, that's a very confusing term. You're absolutely right. And so we get Simon, Jonathan, anything you want to add on those points right there? Okay, I'm gonna actually get to a couple questions here, Charles, because we've got a bunch of them coming in over here. I'm gonna read this question here. I'm curious about the semantics when it comes to the term digital twin, even though this conversation is clear that there are different facets to it. Who, how, and what needs to be done to get to a consistent definition of the approach so that a digital twin doesn't get lost in the evolving digital health tech ecosystem? Really interesting talk. Thank you. I think that's what we've been talking about here so far, and maybe just offering a comment. But who, how, and what needs to be done to get to a consistent definition so that thing what you just talked about, Charles, doesn't happen? Doing stuff like this, right?
Well, I mean, this is step one. I mean, I guess we could create a digital twin consortium in which we try to come up with some sort of broad definition of digital twins and so forth. Maybe that's not a bad idea. But I mean, beyond these kinds of conversations, and I'm not sure.
Okay.
If I can share my experience with the in silico clinical trial terminology, that's a journey that started 4 or 5 years ago with a conference in Barcelona, and then evolved into a consortium, as you were pointing out, Charles. Then we've eventually co-founded an association to try and round people around a table and agree on the terminology, and then promote throughout the ecosystem what we thought by bringing together industry providers and academics, the standard, whether we are talking about the definition of in silico clinical trial or the good methods and best practices for the validation of models before we run those simulated trials. So it will be a protracted effort, but I think collaboration is key.
Okay.
Another point is if it's useful to get a definition only on digital twins, because it's so broad and used in so many disciplines. So if it's necessary to have subcategories, something like digital patient twins or digital device twins, when you talk about the physical device and so on. So this could be another way of defining this in a more precise way in the healthcare domain.
Yeah, that's actually a fantastic point, Simon. For at least the way I think about it, there is the digital twin by itself is kind of a meaningless term. You have a digital twin of something, and you have to say that whole phrase. It is a digital twin of something in order. That whole phrase together has to mean something. Here you hear us like, some people talking about digital twins of people. We have digital twins of cells, digital twins of tissues. Those are all things that are kinds of digital twins of things. But if you just say digital twin, it's not clear what you're talking about.
Exactly.
That's a great point. And actually I'm gonna go lead to an audience question right from that. Okay. It says, and is there any value for digital non-human primate or mouse twins? Would digital animal twin studies help digital human twin studies? Or vice versa? Charles, what do you think?
Oh, that's for me. I think that there's definitely value in coming up with digital twins of mice that you could use for various kinds of experiments. We don't work on that at Unlearn, but I don't know if other panelists would want to comment on that. I do think that there would be value in that, but yeah.
Yeah, we have created a database also of animals. So we are addressing medical devices, so that are in the cardiovascular domain, for example, tested in large animals like sheep, calf, and pigs. And there's a lot of trial and error in the process. So to find the right animal model, the right breed of this, the right size in this. So a lot of animals are used here only for the trial and error process to move on. And we have created these animal models where we can also then test your device in them to find out what is the proper animal model what is the right size, but also find out how you transition the best way from the animal to the human, because you don't design your device for the animal, the implant, but for the humans. And there might be changes also in the trials. And it can be also that you need another design for the animal trial than for the human trial. And this is something where also with this digital representative, you can justify this in front of the regulators, why you change the design in that way for the human population later on. And eventually, hopefully then, of course, get rid of animals in the future at all.
Okay, wonderful.
I can eventually add the same thing regarding the R&D part of the drug development. Actually, for many reasons, it's sometimes easier to collect cell on an animal rather than on a human. So actually, we also are developing models that are available for human cell, but also for mice, rats, any other mammalians species, and then we can predict the same thing. I mean, we can make a prediction on human cells, we can make a prediction on animal cells. Then we have some mapping between the two to see what is relevant and what we can duplicate from an animal model to a human modeling, and it can help also the researcher to understand what could be the difference of the effect of various drugs. So yeah, so it's a digital twin of cell of an animal or digital twin of cell of a human that we have to specify in our title.
Wonderful. Thank you for that. There's several great audience questions I'm going to get to over here. Some of these questions over here, I'm going to address them to Charles and the rest of the panel. I will want to tell the audience over here, we have a great library of content from Unlearn and Endpoints webinars that probably gets into some really detailed. Charles has given some very masterful presentations in the past with us that really will answer some of the details, some of these questions, but I am going to highlight them here for the panel. And this goes back to something you just said, Charles, over here, but I'm going to read the question. What do the panelists think of the possibility of drug development through actual virtual clinical trials, not decentralized ones? Beyond the complexity of full patient simulation, what are the regulatory hurdles, Charles?
Fully virtual clinical trials at the individual level. I think it's a very, very interesting point. The hurdles are more than regulatory, in my opinion. There are technological hurdles, but like before we would talk about being able to get that working. I think one of the things that's interesting as a topic maybe is, I think a lot of times we're talking about, because we all have companies and we're talking about the digital twins that we make today, and how we can use them and how we can provide value to our customers. And that's all interesting and important. But what do the digital twins of 20 or 30 or 50 or 100 years from now look like? I think that when we've looked at the progress that you have in computer technologies, which increase dramatically in terms of capabilities, every couple of years, data is increasing a lot every couple of years. If you try to extrapolate what we will be able to do in 100 years, it's pretty difficult to imagine what that would look like. I think if you say like, do I think we'll be able to do that in 100 years? Yeah, I do. Do I think we'll be able to do it in 5 years? I think that sounds difficult, to where you would take, you say, here's some new chemical entity, we're just going to simulate how this patient would or would not respond with that new chemical. That sounds very, very challenging. But I think 100 years from now, that sounds like we should hopefully be able to do that.
Do that in 100 years. No more humans in clinical trials in 100 years. Okay.
Yeah, Charles, I'd slightly disagree with you, just for ethical reasons. I think even in 100 years, if we have the technology, we'll still need to have some form of human confirmation. The great thing with clinical trial simulation is that you reduce ethical costs of exposing non-responding patients to drug candidates. You zoom in on the best protocol designs, and this is what Nova has been doing for the past 12 years. But at no point, I think, are we suggesting that we'll ultimately be replacing entirely human trials. Because you always want, let's face it, those models are robust predictors, but no, they're not perfect predictors. So you always have in human biology some form of uncertainty in the predictions, and you always want to have the confidence of confirming the model's prediction, even if it's on a reduced sample size. So having a much more efficient process, which is largely driven by computer simulation in 100 years or even sooner than that, for sure. Entirely dispensing with human trials that might be potentially ethically questionable.
That's interesting. I think it's ethically questionable not to. Personally, if the technology would exist, and again, I consider it technologically infeasible today. Like it's certainly today, it is a terrible idea. But if you try to extrapolate where technology could be in 100 years, and if the technology works, you shouldn't experiment on people, in my opinion. If you have the technology not to, then experimenting on real life people would be ethically bad. The gap between where our technology is today and where it needs to get is so large that, you know, we're arguing about 100 years or 1,000 years. I mean, I don't know.
It depends on the type of approach that you're talking about. Because again, we've been doing this for a number of years, and it seems to be working quite well. And the FDA actually has a term for this. It's learn and confirm. So in the view of the regulator, and I think justifiably so, they see in silico as the third emerging pillar in support of in vitro and in vivo, not as a replacement. It needs to be some feedback loop between those three types of experiments so you can really improve on the model and its robustness and predictive capabilities as your program progresses over time. And there's ample evidence. The FDA has created a pilot program called Model-Informed Drug Development in 2018. And there's been a lot of companies and sponsors that participated in the program. A survey was published, I think, last year of some of these participants, and they're pointing towards savings in terms of time, 2 years plus on a single program basis, and tens of millions of dollars saved in reduced sample size. But again, with the feedback and feed forward between human and virtual trials, not in isolation, of course.
Yeah, of course, and I totally hear that from the today question. I just think it's very interesting. When was the first RCT in medicine run? 1948. So 80 less, right? So I think that's this interesting point, right? Again, it's actually relatively, even that's relatively new. And I think so. Again, thinking about where we're at today, the idea of fully virtual, that's not happening. But maybe in the future we'll get there.
And the medical device industry, we are quite advanced in this already. The FDA is pushing this forward a lot, and there have been also certain guidance documents about how to perform proper verification, validation on the models of medical devices, and also how to do the reporting. And also from our experience, but in general, there have been more and more submissions to the regulators as supplementary material, but also more and more as pivotal material. So it's going this direction. And when we talk to regulators in Europe, but also in the US, they see this as the future. This is where it's going, and it's not already the future. It's there. In the domain there. But I agree, it will take some time to completely get rid of any human interaction or animal interaction or other physical testing.
Okay. Let me ask a question that's going to bring the case of digital twins to a much more near-term case over here. And a general question, thank you to the audience. What are the primary use cases digital twins will be able to support within healthcare applications? And when would these be appropriate to integrate? And what are the limitations? So primary use cases of digital twins within healthcare applications now, and when can we integrate them? I think all of you are kind of working on stuff that we're doing right now, right? Charles,
do you want?
Yeah.
I was going to ask if you wanted to direct it to somebody. Otherwise, I could direct it. Yeah, I mean, I think that there are lots and lots of use cases. I can tell you 3 that we are very interested in at Unlearn. The first one is on clinical trials. I think that this is an area where there are lots of current possibilities to use these things. So we work on creating digital twins of patients in clinical trials, and then that can help people run clinical trials with fewer patients receiving placebos, and you can do it a lot faster. So that's one of the areas. We also think about taking that same kind of technology and about creating simulated head-to-head trials of existing treatments, and then you can take that all the way to think about, personalized recommendations of treatments for individual patients, right? So taking this whole concept of whole patient digital twin of person, you can bring that to certain things that are very far. The clinical trial application right now is interesting because through randomization, if you still run these trials in a randomized way, there are ways that you can actually mathematically guarantee that the errors the imperfections in your model used to create your digital twins will not leak into the results of your clinical trial. And that's super untrue as soon as you start saying like, hey, we're going to give this patient this drug because the computer said it. As soon as you say that, all of a sudden there is like this the computer better be right. But in the clinical trial space, you have this ability to do it. But we have other people here who are working not on the clinical trial space. I'd also like to hear, what are those other thoughts?
Yeah, Francois, let's hear from you. What are you doing to integrate that right now?
I'm actually one of the ones working in the clinical trial space. So largely the same application as Charles mentioned, maybe adding to this some things that we've been doing quite a lot over the past couple of years is in post-market. So your drug has been approved, but you realize that you're lacking sufficient clinical evidence to support pricing and reimbursement discussions with payers. And so, for instance, you would need to have a phase 4 trial lasting for, in some instances and some indications, 4 to 5 years. And you do want to reach a conclusion on the price, obviously sooner than that. And that's typically where you can use simulation and simulated trials to run the dynamics and try and build and add digital evidence to the dossier and get to conclusion faster.
Okay. Thank you for that, Simon.
Yeah, from our side, we have three applications there. So on the one hand, preclinical, where this is used for R&D purposes for the medical device developers to develop their devices and help them on that. Then also the clinical trial stage, where this is then applied for using then the virtual patients for testing this on a bigger patient cohort system. And the third application is then the clinical decision support, where then on a more individual based, once the device is already on the market, before an implantation of the device, this can be tested to see what is the proper location there, what is the proper size, for example, type of model, the proper device that should be implanted, and evaluate this then, and then perform the operation.
Jonathan?
Well, actually, we work on the really preclinical, like a research part. So the way we see the use of the digital twin is really to kind of a decision tools to help biologists to understand why should I pursue on these specific targets, or why should I pursue there. It's a way already to give confidence in the choice that you make early in the drug discovery process, to have like knowledgeable choices of, okay, I'm working on this target because I know exactly how are the mechanism of action behind the process of the application of the drugs, and etc. And actually, this helps a lot after when you go into preclinical or clinical, because you can go with a reduced number of drugs to be tested. So it's not a full application on directly applied to a patient. So we cannot claim that it will work on a patient, but at least at a cellular level, you know what you are doing, and it is a great advancement.
Okay. I want to get to a question here from the audience. There's a couple of different ways it's being asked, but let me come out from the broadest question here. I'm going to read it. There tends to be a large uncertainties associated with modeling, measurement, and simulation, especially in biology and life sciences. How can these uncertainties be accounted for within the digital twin framework? Shouldn't each patient really give rise to a personalized digital population, not just a single digital twin? Francois, do you want to take that one first?
That is very true, and actually reverberates with the point I was making on the hidden variables. You actually have you never have a perfect match, a perfect digital twin. You have potentially hundreds of digital twins that share commonalities with you. So it's all about the way you deal with this uncertainty. That is, by the way, intrinsic to human biology. So you need to account for this in the simulation. You also need to make sure, and this is really speaking about the way we build our disease models at Nova, that the model has sufficiently accounted for the known dynamics, so you can reproduce independently validation data sets. So you're comfortable with the behavior of your model, and you can generate virtual patients on the back of it, and you try and have as large a heterogeneity in your patient population to cover all the potential iterations. But very good question indeed.
Great. Anyone else want to take that question? Okay. Let's move on. I want to ask, I'll get a little bit narrow, and maybe this is back to you, Francois. But the question here is, how is the best way to determine what data is required to construct a digital twin of a human organ or organism, both in terms of what data can be used to parameterize the digital twin to a particular organ or organism, and the data that is not actually collected from the organ in question, but from other organs that can be used to best fit a digital twin to a particular organ? So how is the best way to determine what data is required to construct that digital twin?
So I'll give a very generic answer and then probably hand it over to Simon, who's closer to the medical devices space. Organ modeling really deals with medical devices in general. The way we build our disease models is not on based on organs. We're describing what is understood of the various mechanism within a given pathophysiology. And the reality is that it's impossible to determine ex ante. You need to start to build your model by curating and extracting pieces of knowledge from scientific articles, map the biological entities implicated in the system, the causal relationships, mathematical equations ultimately, and then you get the parameter set for which you will need to have access to data to parameterize. So before you start building a disease model, there's no way to be very exhaustive in terms of the data you need. But again, organ is probably closer to Simon's remit.
Simon, do you have anything to add?
Yes, so to model an organ, you need to start on different levels. So you see this on different levels. So you can start on the macroscopic domain. So coming from, for example, imaging data to have the anatomy of the heart or another organ. And then from the macroscopic way going down more and more to the microscopic way, the cell level. Of course, the anatomy of that is not yet everything, because the heart muscles and everything is a very complex environment, very complex tissue with fibers, recombination, and so on. So you need also to account for this. And then there comes the material properties, calcification levels, and then the cell level on that domain. And fully agree also on the question. So you cannot have all these properties of the certain patient, because to have, for example, when you want to do testing, a tensile test on a specific vessel, you wouldn't need this vessel. Of course, then the patient would be there. So this is not helpful then anymore. So what you need is to perform this on a widespread population and also cluster the population on different disease states, for example, pathologies, in this case then, for example, classifications, and then use this then also for the simulation environment. And a very good point in the simulation is that you have the possibility to simulate over these uncertainties. You can also use these uncertainties, because exactly what was also coming from the other question is, what is the question when you define a parameter range or change the parameters in this? And this is the beauty of the simulation, because you can simulate all these. So for example, you can simulate also what is the direction of an implant for a healthy state, but also for a disease state, a very severe calcification state, and so on. And this can then be tested in with the same patient or anatomy for different states in this, and create then this uncertainty as an advantage for the simulation.
Beautiful. I'm going to direct this next question first to you, Charles. For therapeutic areas where the standard of care is rapidly changing because of multiple new treatment options being available, how would simulated patient models deal with that, since there's usually limited information on how those new treatments are impacting the disease?
Well, I think that there are three questions there. Actually, I'm going to unpack it in three different ways. The first question is, should they? And I think that actually depends a lot now on what your use case is. There are certain use cases where they absolutely had better do that, and there's other use cases where maybe it's not that important. I think that it's very, very important. Anyone who's doing any modeling, computer modeling of anything, is doing it for some use case, right? They're not just that's super important. All of these questions about how you deal with uncertainties, how you select data, and all that stuff depends on what you're using it for. So you start with some use case. And then the second question is how do you actually achieve it? I think that there are definitely use cases where you would want that, where like personalized medicine, for example, clinical decision support. If your doctor is pulling up your digital twin and trying to say, how are you going to respond on treatment A, B, or C, then you better have data and predictions for treatment A, B, or C. So if you were going in that direction, I mean, it's a problem you got to solve, so like the best way to solve that problem is to not have the data be limited, like to figure out how to get the data that you would need to answer that question. And that kind of turns into a technical problem of how you want to deal with it. But there's no great answer to that question. Like you have to solve the technical problem of figuring out how to do it.
Okay. I'm going to ask this, and let me ask this question because it asked a couple different ways here. The broadest way it's being asked is, what is the regulatory perspective on digital twins? But let me ask the more specific question here too. What would it take in terms of data, and where can we find that information to fully validate predictions of these computer simulations in order to convince healthcare professionals to change their behavior? Charles, do you want to take that one, and I'll go to the panel?
I mean, I guess, again, I think that the question, to go back to the two things I've said before, digital twin of blank. So you got to think about what that is, and you got to think about what the use case is, because there's a whole bunch of use cases here that are completely unregulated. Okay, so if you are using digital twins of cells to find perturbations that you're doing for drug discovery, then what's going to be regulated is the drug that you discover, not the method you use to discover it, right? If you are, for example, in our case, you're creating digital twins of patients in clinical trials, right? It's also the use of those digital twins that is regulated. Still actually not entirely how they're created. So, you can go to the EMA's website and you can read the draft qualification about our approach for how you can do that. There are ways that you can figure out how to design your clinical trial. That the clinical trial designs are regulated, not the model that makes the twins in some sense. So it just depends entirely on the use case and how you are trying to use it. Like that question. I don't know if other people want to chime in there. I mean, I talked a little bit, I think, Jonathan, about your this is your perspective.
Well, you made the answer to for me, so I'm just gonna repeat on our side. I mean, we are not responsible. I mean, the tools that we are developing is not regulated itself, but as you mentioned, it's up to the biotech or the pharma working with our tool to validate and to make sure that the drug that has been discovered is okay. But I mean, what we do here is just a tool to help people take decisions. So it's a very particular way of using our digital twin as a decision maker tool. And it's maybe not fully exactly the same thing as for a clinical replicate of a patient, for example.
I'm happy to give you the perspective from a clinical trial simulation standpoint. So I've mentioned before the FDA's model-informed drug development pilot program and now team, and so they're in the process of drafting good practices, and it's actually a very collaborative effort where the intention is to spell out expectations in terms of how you validate the models, and then the regulator will assess the risk, the intensity of the digital input in designing your trial in human subjects. So if it's just marginal contribution in terms of information, then most likely it's going to be approved, not the product itself, not the drug candidate, but the use of in silico. If you're really going for an aggressive use of in silico approach, potentially in certain circumstances, even going as far as replacing at least partly human subjects, then you will need to have to face very stringent quantitative validation thresholds. So it really is in the process of being formalized, but there's been quite a lot of work done on good simulation practice over the past few years.
All right. We've got just about 5 minutes left, and I've got one final question, and I would like to get everyone's answer to this. As we've been defining digital twins and digital twin of something here, I would like to ask each of you, what have digital twins allow you to achieve, or your companies achieve, that was not previously possible? Jonathan, let's start with you.
Well, it's a good question. I like to say that digital twin is a way to ask like what if I do this on my system? What happened? So this is the way I will define like a digital twin is like a what if tool. What if I apply that to a cell? What if I apply this perturbation to a patient? What if I do this? What if I do that? And if you can have an answer that you can elaborate and with like a good level of uncertainty that you can handle, then I will say that you have an efficient digital twin tool. So this is the way I see it. But obviously, I'm happy to discuss that with also other members.
Okay, Simon, what have digital twins allow you to do in medical devices that you weren't previously able to do?
Yeah, for us, digital twin has become the core of our company, or we started also calling this virtual patients. That's also why our product is called V-Patients. So this is the basis of what our users can do, and all that connection with the data ingestion of that system, and then using simulation and predictive analytics and so on. So it really is the core of the company, and this is what is very important for us, and also what drives us.
All right, Francois, let's hear it from you.
So a very concrete example, something that we've worked on fairly recently, where a sponsor had a drug candidate in oncology targeted towards a very particular subgroup of patients harboring a specific mutation. And those patients were known not to be responsive to the standard of care that was required to be used in the placebo arm. So effectively, we've generated digital twins of the treated arm to avoid subjecting human patients to a drug that they were known to be responsive with.
Charles Fisher, CEO of Unlearn, you've got the last word. What have digital twins allowed you to do that were not previously possible?
I mean, so Unlearn's purpose, our kind of mission, is to advance artificial intelligence to eliminate trial and error in medicine. And that is something that I think, if you just think about that purpose, that broadly kind of requires this technology. It requires these kinds of technologies to exist if you're going to eliminate real world trial and error in medicine put in a computer. In terms of what we've been able to do, what we focus on today is how we can apply digital twins of patients in trials to create trial designs that are much, much faster. So you can cut a year or two off of that design. And we can typically, we're aiming to say eliminate 25% or so of the placebo group in the clinical trial. Key thing that a digital twin lets us do that you can't do with other things is that we can ensure, because of the way we're doing it, that we get unbiased estimates for the effects of treatments from those trials. And that's what's allowed us to go and get regulatory qualification and to run these trials in a rigorous way that provide the same exact evidence as bigger, more expensive RCTs.
All right. Thank you, Charles. I want to thank Francois Boissel, Simon Sontag, and Jonathan Baptista. Thank you to the entire panel for your expertise today. I want to thank everyone in the audience for tuning in. I also want to direct you to Endpoint's webinars. We've got some great content from Unlearn in the past. If your question wasn't answered today, Charles has done some amazing work in the past with some presentations that could get much more in depth with some of these questions. So I definitely encourage everyone in the audience to check those. They're really great content. If you'd like to rewatch this webinar or to share it with your colleagues, a link for on-demand viewing will be sent tomorrow. I am Arslan Arya for Endpoints News. Thanks again to Unlearn for sponsoring the discussion. Thanks for joining us, and we hope to see you at a future webinar. Thanks, everyone.